All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for the Museum of North Idaho's author interview series. And we are interviewing Stephen Sheppherd about his book, Hydromania, A History of the Diamond Cup. And Stephen, thank you for being with me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I had the opportunity to listen to John Mueller earlier, and I pale, I think, by comparison, but a lot of the stuff that John talked about with the city parks somewhat relates to things that happened in my book. And I enjoyed that. I hope you enjoy this presentation. I'm going to jump over and try to start to share the screen. This may take a second. Use some of the graphics that I have, and most of these come from the photo archive at the Museum of North Idaho, which is the source for most of the material that's in my book. And so it'll take me just a second to get that going. Are the pictures there?
They are there.
Okay. The book, as indicated on this particular slide, starts really back in the early part of the last century. Formal boat racing actually got started on Lake Coeur d'Alene, or Lake Coeur d'Alene, as I prefer to pronounce it. It's a different show we could probably do. But Lake Coeur d'Alene had boat racing, organized boat racing back as early as 1913. And the last race is depicted in the other picture. The Diamond Cup, the last race here on Lake Coeur d'Alene, was in 2013. And that's quite a span. And there's the bulk of the book explains why there was such a 100 years, but we only actually raced close to 35 of those 100 years. The first race in 1913 came into being because of our region of around Coeur d'Alene was going through a rather deep depression. With the mines and the lumber mills were suffering. The economy was not too good at all. They weren't getting much of a return on, in fact, they weren't able to sell a lot of the material that was coming out of the mines. I guess depressed prices that hit them pretty badly. So the city fathers in Coeur d'Alene were looking at ways to try to get people to come in to the community, basically to put money in the pockets of the people of the town. And corollary to what John talked about in his book, that there had been a push with Fred Blackwell and others to using the railroads and the steamboats and a variety of other things to bring people to the community. They built the city park, Blackwell's Park, and which eventually morphed into the city of Coeur d'Alene's park. But they were looking for other ways to bring people in on a weekend or during a highlight part of the summer, much as they do today, you know, with the marathon and with the other activities, Coeur d'Alene, those type of things, to bring people in and to raise some money, basically to keep the businesses going during this time of depression. And so they settled on a regatta, and the initial plan for it was to focus on aquatics, swimming, jumping, all kinds of boating, canoeing, boat racing with small engines, outboard engines, inboard runabouts. just about everything that you could think of aquatic over a 3-day period over the 4th of July formed the Coeur d'Alene Regatta. The picture on the left-hand side is the trophy, one of the trophies that was handed out during that first 4th of July weekend. And if you look closely, it's solid silver, and it has, I believe it's probably deer horn attached to the sides of it. And Pete will remember this, my brother who's watching. We took a trip up to Nelson, British Columbia. It was there on a beautiful river right next to it. And I had read in my research on the book, the second book I'm doing, which is on Miss Spokane, that Miss Spokane had tested on that particular river. So we went up to see what we could find out about it, and went to the historical museum there in Nelson. And one of the first things that I saw when I walked, paid my money to get into the museum and walked in, was this trophy. Here's the trophy that I believe it was a 6-man boat that from Nelson, they had traveled all the way down, and that would not have been easy, more than likely. They would have probably come by train rather than by automobile, bringing their boat down here. But they won the very first regatta, 6-man regatta, and this is the trophy that they have. The regattas lasted from 1913 until 1940. The movement was towards World War II. The war had actually started in Europe, and the decision was made to back off. No more races of the regatta type races after 1940. But that's the, interestingly enough, that's the original trophy. The other trophy was the trophy that was constructed by a gentleman named Ted Anderson. He's also the guy that drew the picture of, here's on the other side, I guess, drew the picture that's on my shirt of the Hydromaniac. He was part of the group that helped put the first race together, and he hand designed it. And then Evers's Jewelry downtown constructed it. And it was a combination of, I believe the bottom of it was silver. There was some plastic involved in it. And the diamonds were not, of course, for real, but it served as the trophy from 1958 until 1968. It was destroyed in a fire in the Desert Hotel in 1972, I believe. When they found it, it was a small lump of metal. So I guess it proved that it wasn't all plastic. See if I can get this to move forward. A little closer picture of the regatta. Actually, now that I see it, it says the second annual, so that would have been 1914. This shows, the picture was taken from City Beach, and I believe it was variously, this is from the Museum of North Idaho collection, and it's described as having been 1913, but it more than likely was closer to 1915, 1916. For a portion of the regatta years, they had the people sit on planks that were placed on the beach itself, and that's what you're seeing. There were articles in the Coeur d'Alene Press and the Spokesman Review that indicated that upwards of 20,000 people attended the regatta weekend. And if you look closely in the very center of it, out in the water, there's a platform, and that's where the swimming and the diving all took place. And then the regatta itself took place beyond the log boom area, beyond that platform. And And I'll talk about that in a little bit in a minute. This is one of the locations where the people sat and watched the events. And it drew a tremendous amount of people. At that time, as John said, they weren't competing with Manitou Park in Spokane and Liberty Lake Park and some of the other parks that kind of cut into the crowd. But it does show the configuration of how City Beach was used. People would come spend time in the park and then wander down to the water side and watch the events as they took place. And again, there's some argument over just exactly when this was built. The story that I got originally was 1913. The city fathers suggested that they build a covered viewing area for the people to attend the race and watch the event. And because sometimes on the 4th of July, if you've been in Coeur d'Alene for any length of time, you know that sometimes 4th of July can be a little cold and wet. And so to make sure that a good number of the people stayed dry during that time frame, they built a grandstand on the side of Tubbs Hill, out towards Corbin Point. And today, if you wander along the lakeside there, you can still see some of the footings, or the concrete footings that they poured for the grandstand. To get to the grandstand, you had to, there are 3 ways that you could get there. You could walk through the mill parking or mill area along the base of Tubbs Hill from 3rd Street, or you could take the train to a stop at 11th Street, 11th and Sherman, and get off of there and walk down to the lake from 11th and Sherman down to Lakeshore, and then walk out and around Tubbs Hill. And I think it's, what, a 1.5 mile walk from that particular location to get to where the grandstand was and where the viewing area was. But as you can see in the picture, they had upwards of 5,000 people, paying customers. You paid to sit there. If you didn't pay, then you would sit on the hillside outside. I believe in 1914, it rained pretty heavily, so it was a good deal to be sitting inside. By 1915, they had moved the whole thing back to City Beach. The races back in the early years ran from City Beach and the city park out to the mouth of Kidd Island Bay. It went from City Beach to Kidd Island Bay and over to what is now called Arrow Point, and it keeps wanting to shift. And they would run, and it varied from year to year, but they had the inboard regatta they had was an open race where any class. I'll jump ahead to the next one. This particular picture is of a gentleman named Bob Yount. And Bob ran a boat building operation. Down in the area of, it would be right about where the Coeur d'Alene Resort is right now. And he built a lot of the runabouts that were used in the boat races. This particular one is the Greyhound. Darn it. About 28 feet long, if I remember the measurements on it. It still exists. We see it almost every year up at Chelan at the Mahogany and Merlot. And it was operated a small aircraft engine in that area that next to where the open area where Bob is standing. And it could get upwards of 70 miles an hour. So they were moving quite well for a boat during that time frame. I believe this one ran in the early 1920s. But Bob's name was on a number of the boats that were built. A lot of the boats that raced in those early regattas were owned by gentlemen from Spokane, Augie Paulson, for example, August Paulson, who was involved, had made money off of the mines in the Silver Valley. He built a number of boats. Peyton, actually the Peyton brothers, who also made money off the mines in the Silver Valley, bought some of Bob's boats, and they were, it was quite an interesting period. The races didn't last very long, but there were upwards of 10 to 12 boats running of different sizes, and the starts in some cases were quite interesting as a result. This is another of Bob's boats that won the regatta. In later years, the boats people's interest for a good long time, and over the years, the activities dropped from 3 days down to a one-day celebration on the 4th, and they basically, the war put an end to it. There was a break in time between 1940, of course, and 1958, when they had outboard races every year on the 5th, but there was nothing formal as far as a and perhaps for the same reasons that they had started the races back in 1913, the decision was made to try to bring people back into the community. Well, the decision was made to do something at about the same time that the gentlemen were trying to figure out some way to bring people to town. William Boeing, owner of Boeing Aircraft in Seattle, and a number of other gentlemen on that side of the Cascades, were also getting together and trying to figure out ways to expand the unlimited boat racing community and the number of towns that they had races in. And so through a variety of ways, the two were brought together. Boeing came over and met with the gentleman at the ART, which included Bob McDonald, who was he was the manager of the Athletic Roundtable, Burl Hagedorn, Dwayne's dad, who was the managing editor, owner of the Coeur d'Alene Press, and quite a number of other downtown businessmen met with him, and the decision was made to apply for a sanction through the American Powerboat Association to have a race in Coeur d'Alene. And that took place in June, interestingly enough, of 1958. It was after the Apple Cup and before Seafair in Seattle. So it was an opportunity for the boats they were hoping that some of the boats from the eastern part of the country would come out and participate, but only one of them would end up doing that. The first race, the decision was to place the viewing area, use the viewing areas of Tubbs Hill, City Beach, and the area between City Beach and the mouth of Kidd Island, which interestingly enough, it correlates pretty much with how the race course was set up for 1913 and beyond as part of the regatta. This time they decided to, and if I could get my PowerPoint to work properly, One of the pictures I have in the PowerPoint is of the log boom. They set up a log boom from City Beach, basically, just short of City Beach, all the way to what we call 3 Mile Point, those of us who grew up in the area.
Well, I don't think it was your PowerPoint. I think somebody actually came in and took over our meeting.
And I think they may be gone now, do you think? We can try one more time. But, post disabled screen sharing, so that's not going to work. Anyway, the log boom was basically just a string of logs connected by wire between the two of them, and between each log, and it ran essentially 3 miles down, a mile across, and then probably a half mile covered along the area along Tubbs Hill. And that formed, there was a 3 mile course inside of that. And that's where they raced. The speeds, when we were talking about unlimited hydroplanes, had to be 28 feet or longer. They were powered during the time frame that we're talking about by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, or Allison engines. The Rolls Merlin engines had been used in the Spitfires that had flown in other British planes that had flown during World War II, and the Allisons were used in P-51s and other airplanes that were used during for our Air Corps during World War II. And that's what powered them. 17, shake your head if I'm wrong, Bob, but 1,710 horsepower and about top speed for most of the boats that were headed on the straightaway on Lake Coeur d'Alene. They probably topped out at about 170, 180. The average speed for a 3 mile lap was somewhere in the air. The average for those that competed was somewhere between 95 and 105 miles an hour. I think the record for the lake was 118, which was, I believe, set in the very first year. It's in the book. I didn't memorize everything that was there, but it was an interesting first year or two. The weather that had plagued the early regattas in 1913, 1914 came back the very first year, and they had to cancel the first day of the 1958 regatta because of high winds and rain. And there were winds on Sunday as well. I don't know, Pete was with us, my brother Pete, who's watching this, but we watched that first race out on Lake Coeur d'Alene on the log boom, about halfway down, and on my uncle's boat. And it cost, I believe, about $25, which you figure back then that $25 would have been the equal to about $250 for a boom pass. So it was quite an investment for my uncle to do that. And then he had a 26-foot Owens, and anything over 25 feet cost another $10. So the bigger the boat, the more it costs for you to be out there. But it was an interesting place to watch the race. We couldn't leave once we were there, but it was a tremendously interesting day. We'd hoped to be out there on Saturday. We just arrived back in town. My dad was career military, and we'd come back to just happened to be there when that first race was.
Have a head.
That got me going. What was that, Pete?
Did have a head.
Yeah, that's true. That was another problem. We won't go into that right now, but and the race they made just enough money to keep going for a second year, and made just enough money to go for a third year. But as my book points out, kind of behind the scenes, there were some people making sure that there was enough money. The Richards family, the Hagedorns, a number of the others put up money to make sure that the whole process continued. It hit a wall in 1961 when only 6 boats showed up. And they had to cut the boat race to one day, and the people didn't show up. And there was always an element of economics involved in whether or not the race was successful. And it probably would have continued had it not been for the fact that the boat racers were, at the time that it was getting harder and harder for the city to raise the money to put the boat races on, the boat racers were wanting to be paid to come and race their very expensive boats. And finally, in 1968, the decision was to quit fighting the fight. And after the 1968 race, when they tried to put together a 1969 race, they canceled out. It actually cost them, there was a race every year from 1958 to 1968, with the exception of 1967. And that was because of the economics that were involved in it. One of the reasons that I wrote the book was that there's kind of a false impression out there that what killed the boat races was rioting. And I will be the first to admit that there were civil disturbances. I think one of the slides that I was going to show you showed the by year the number of people that were picked up the weekend of the boat races that during the riots. And the most, I think, ever arrested were 109. And that was like 1963, 64, so 63, I believe, 62, 63. Which, when you compare it to some weekends, big weekends that we have in the city, that many people are often arrested for a variety of things. Nobody that I could find in any of the research that I did actually was arrested for rioting. There were fights, they were throwing bottles, they were picked up for minor consuming, a good deal of them. When you go through and you look, there were very few people from the city of Coeur d'Alene that were arrested. They were mostly people from outside of the area. Quite a number of them from the Seattle area. Another pocket of people coming out of Fairchild Air Force Base. And there's a bit of a little story in there about the head of the Air Force Base making the city off limits from that point forward. There was a bit of embarrassment that came out of the fact that every Monday after the boat race, the Coeur d'Alene Press would post the names of the people that were arrested, including the young people from outside the area that were picked up for minor consuming or open container, that type of thing. So the word got back to the boss at Fairchild Air Force Base, and he cut them off at that point. So it up through 1963, 1964, there were disturbances. The first 2 years, nothing. 1960, a little bit more in 61, and it kind of built up to 63, and then the city got tough, and they had a greater police and a more organized police presence downtown in the areas where there would have been a problem. My brother's band was playing in 1963, a team dance that they put together on Saturday night and the Shadow, or his particular group, was to play down there. And just about the time that they were ready to start, the city police and city fathers came down and shut down the dance. And of course, they had several hundred kids there for the dance, and they were released back into the center of the community. And then the police officers started at from one end of Sherman to the other, and the two streets on either side of Sherman, and pushed towards the middle, arresting anybody that didn't answer their warnings to leave. And that really kind of put an end to it. The following year, the city had a better plan. They put up just exactly what they would tolerate and what they wouldn't. You know, the kinds of things that were acceptable behavior downtown, and they arrested anybody, open container, being, not standing in groups and that type of thing. They really were enforcing the rules, and it got better again. So by the 1966 and 65, 66, and 68 races, there were many more people arrested the weekend of the races than there were arrested over the 4th of July. The real story, the real reason that the boat races left our community in 1968 was because of a lack of money and a lack of people willing to work to raise the money. And each of the chapters in my book goes through and talks about the number of people arrested and the impact that the problems that they did have had on the community. But really, when you look back on it historically, it wasn't riots that killed the Diamond Cup. It was the lack of money. That's what it really all comes down to. When they had the race in 2013, similar situation. No measurable misbehavior. In fact, I believe the sheriff came out that weekend and praised the community for the way that they behaved. There were no issues whatsoever that weekend. But again, it came down to volunteers, lack of sponsors to be able to pay the high price of bringing the boats in. And part of it was security problems, not being able to close the fences and be able to make the money that they needed to make it a go. So and because they didn't make the money, there were issues with the finances, and when they tried to run it again in 2014, that they ran up against the inability to raise money, and the city, in particular the county sheriff, not wanting to allow the race unless they proved that they could make it financially and pay the people that they needed to. It's a long, wonderful history that basically it came down to money is what killed the Diamond Cup. The book itself, as I said, covers from 2013 all the way back to 1913. I have to thank Bob Singletary for expanding the book. It wasn't going to be as long as it ended up being, 376 pages. But Bob put me on to the fact that there were boat races back, pretty significant boat racing history back then, and put me on to that. So I started adding another section to the race. The middle part, of course, is about the 10 years or from 58 to 68 of the actual Diamond Cup. And then the last portion of the book carries us up through almost to 2013 as they were preparing for the 2013 race. There were many, many attempts from 1969 on up to 2013 to bring the boats back. But initially, it was fear of having the kinds of problems that they had at a rock concert out at Athol come into the community that kept it away. that got tied in with the riots, the rumor that there were riots here. And they actually got to the point where they passed a city ordinance that banned boat racing inside the city limits. And they conveniently set up the ordinance so that there was no possible way for you to put on a boat race using the city beach, Tubbs Hill, using that 3-mile corridor that they used from 58 to 68. They got around that in 2011 because they didn't have a race, they had an exhibition. And we had 4 boats over, Bob, that weekend. And 4 of the unlimiteds, a couple of them that had actually raced in Coeur d'Alene. And they brought over a number of limited hydroplanes, including Bob's boat, a number of them from the Spokane area, and put on a really nice exhibition, and which built things up so that they were able to put on the 2013 race. But that's how deep the politics became, that it finally came down to the city saying, we've had enough of these attempts to put on a boat race. We don't want the boat race. And they passed a city ordinance to get rid of it. I've got a copy of it in my file somewhere. It's very, very specific. The exact area of the city beach and Tubbs Hill and the 3-mile course, you could not have a boat race in that area. It was a 5-year process. I was a school administrator for 21 and a half years out of a 36-year career as a teacher, educator. And this was my bucket list activity, was to put together a book. And I wanted to tell the story and tell as much of the story as I possibly could so that it wasn't lost for posterity. And so that someone like your husband, Jocelyn, could pick up the book at some future date and be able to know what happened. And it is kind of dense. If you want to find out what happened on Tuesday of race week in 1963, I have it broken down by day, and you can find out who qualified and who the characters were, who the people were that were involved. Not only the boat racers, but the local people that were involved. The index in the back of my book takes up several of those 376 pages. And we decided to put that index in there because there were so many city people and so many families that were represented by the people that put on the boat race. And so when you take a look at the book, take a look at the back. There are so many, including my brothers, I think, that are included there because their pictures show up in the book. But it's about people, and it's about a place, kind of like John's book was when we were talking about it earlier. The people in a place and the event and all of the excitement and all of the intrigue and unfortunately all of the politics that were involved in it too. Unfortunately, and John talked about this too, unfortunately I wasn't able to talk to all the people I would like to have talked to, because by the time I retired in 2008 from education, many of those people had passed on. They were no longer with us. I was lucky to be able to talk to Wayne Hagedon, who he receives a lot of criticism in this community. I hear it. I try to respond to it when I can. But when you start looking at what the boat races did to the downtown area, from an industrial area that wasn't usable by anybody to an area that has one of the most beautiful city park systems, anywhere in the country. A beautiful resort facility and conventions facility that brings hundreds, if not thousands, of people every day into our community. The improvements that were made to the facilities around our community, a lot of that came out of the boat racing period. And Dwayne was behind those. There are things that were done that may not have been made a lot of people happy, but really that area of our community is better because of what Dwayne did and the other people that he was involved with in putting the boat races together. If you read my book, which I hope you do, it gets into the contributions that the Richards family, the Dingle family, the McDonald's, and certainly the Hagedorns had on bringing in, even Bob Templin, can't forget Bob Templin, his contributions, that really brought the city out of the doldrums in the middle 1950s to the vibrant city that it is today on any given afternoon.
With that, I'd like to share my screen so we can see where to get a copy of your book. Okay, I think that's up. So this is our redesigned website, museumni.org, and Hydromania is available in our bookstore. It makes a wonderful gift, as Stephen pointed out, and there's over 100 photographs within the contents of the book.
Some of those had never been seen before until they were printed in my book. I had permission to use museums' photos, of course. The Carter Crimp's photos that he took. He was one of the Commodores. I was able to use Bob Carver's photos. Bob Carver was is the great hydroplane photographer of the period. Was blessed to be able to use those, and some of those never made it into print. The Carver family and Eileen Crimmins' son provided pictures that were never printed anywhere else besides my book. And they tell little stories. There's a story, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are stories behind every picture. And I was fortunate to be able to have access to so many stories to be able to share in the form of pictures that are in the book. It started out, it was just going to be a paperback book, and it became a hardback. It is a hardback book, coffee table size book, and it's heavy enough that packing it around can be sometimes fun too. But hopefully we can sell a few. The whole purpose of me being involved with this, and I'm a volunteer with the museum. Bob's been a volunteer with the museum. The reason that we've done it is to pay back to the community for the kindnesses that they've shown to us. I would not have been able to print this book had it not been for the Museum of North Idaho. And Jocelyn, thank you, and
Yes, thank you for your presentation, and I'm sorry about the disruption, but I will edit that out. And we've come to 2 o'clock, so.
Can I ask a question, please?
John's coming up. Be sure to stick around for John. He's got a good story to tell.
He's on a different link, so I gotta hop over there, but.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Deborah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.